Welcome to St. Andrew's Cathedral in St. Andrews, Scotland. As you can see, it was at one time a cathedral. It's been in ruin for many years. But once upon a time, it was a magnificent structure. Absolutely beautiful, and I would love to introduce it to you now. Has a long history. Starts off in the Dark Ages, actually. Back in the Dark Ages, there was a town. Well, the town of St. Andrews, which we know today, was originally known as Kilrimone. It looks like it's spelled Kilramont, but it's pronounced Kilrimone, which means Church of the King's Mount. There was a monastic community here during the reign of Angus I, who was the king of the Picts, who ruled from AD 729 to 761, and he was the leader of the powerful Pictish dynasty which founded St. Andrews. In 943, King Constantine II abdicated the throne in order to become leader of the monastic community. There's a good chance that before this time that Kilrimone became the headquarters of the Scottish Church. The Scottish Church was dominated by abbots, such as Constantine, rather than by bishops responsible for geographical areas called dioceses, which was actually more common. Here in Kilrimone, there was an early church at the edge of the promontory overlooking the harbor, known as St. Mary on the Rock, as pictured here. This church housed many of the successors of the early Celtic monks in the Middle Ages. If you go to visit the ruins of the cathedral, these older ruins of St. Mary on the Rock are in the very back of it. Now I mentioned that the Scottish Church was dominated by abbots, but from the 10th century there were chief bishops of the Scots, some of whom were probably based at Kilrimone. Before a cathedral was built, it started out as a small church known as St. Rules. Legend has it that St. Regulus, aka St. Rule, was the guardian of the relics of St. Andrew at Patras in Greece in the 4th century. He was warned by an angel that they were to be removed to Constantinople, so Regulus took them elsewhere. Eventually his boat was wrecked off the Fife coast, and the bones of St. Andrew were brought to Kilrimone and interred into a shrine. Of course, this is only legend, with probably very little evidence to back it up. If there are indeed any relics here, then they were most likely brought over by Bishop Acca of Hexham, who was banished from his English diocese in 732 and spent part of his exile in Pictland, which is Scotland north of the Forth. But the St. Regulus legend is sacred to Scottish people to this day. Many still hold it to be true. Now, the actual St. Rule's Church was built during the transition from Celtic Kilrimone to medieval St. Andrews, probably around 1130 to 1150, during Bishop Robert's time. Bishop Robert was appointed Bishop of Kilrimone by Alexander I, the fifth son of King Malcolm III and Queen Margaret, also known as Saint Margaret. Architectural evidence shows that it may have been built by the same masons who built one of Nostell's churches, referring to Nostell Priory, which was Scon's mother house in Yorkshire. Bishop Robert eventually became prior of Scone. So it looks as if most of what we see at St. Rule's was built by Bishop Robert after his consecration in 1127, and it was extended before 1144. The tower and chancel are all that survive of St. Rule's. Built of blocks of finely finished sandstone, it has a chamfered base course around the bottom of the walls, and a string course on corbels at the level of the chancel wallhead. The tower and chancel were linked by a high arch, which is now blocked. Lighting the chancel were two windows set high in each of its side walls. Bishop Arnold eventually stepped in as Robert's successor. Bishop Arnold is the one who started construction on the cathedral in AD 1160. And it eventually grew to be the longest and greatest church in all of Scotland. It was quite small to Europe standards, but changed the way Scotland started building their cathedrals. The initial reason for the cathedral's construction was because St. Rule's Church became just too small for the chapter of Augustinian canons. Most of the important parts were first built, including the presbytery, with its high altar, and the choir, housing the canon's stalls. The project took forever. In 1202, Bishop Roger had to be buried in the old church of St. Rule because the cathedral was still not complete. So his successor, William Mavoison, was the first official bishop to be buried there in 1238. Most of the nave was completed in the 1270s, but the mortar was hardly dry when the west front was blown down in a great gale. The front was rebuilt a little farther back. The War of Independence with England in 1296 prevented consecration of the completed building until July 5, 1318, just 4 years after Robert the Bruce's victory at Bannockburn. The consecration was then carried out in a great ceremony in the presence of the king. In 1378, there was a great fire, and the upper part of the west front was destroyed, so it had to be rebuilt. There were 2 tiers of windows that were also added during this time. These windows had triangular groupings of 3 circles, which suggest an early example of French architecture influence. No one really knows which bishop paid for this. All we know is that Bishop Landelus, who died in 1385, had been appointed at the request of the French king, and Bishop Trail, who died in 1401, had been educated at the university in Paris. Either bishop knew France well enough to have introduced the idea at a time when relations with England were again poor. This is the south aisle wall of the nave from the cloister. It gives a clear indication of a change in architectural style from Romanesque to Gothic. The most obvious change is in the design of the windows, which pass from the round-headed shape to the wider pointed form with Y tracery, as you can see in the picture. The surviving part of the precinct wall begins at the northeast corner of the cathedral, which goes around the east and south sides, and ends up at a section on the southwest side, which has been realigned in modern times. Today, there are 13 towers and 4 gateways that have survived, including Penn's Gate, which is the main gateway. The upper parts of the wall date from the time of Prior John Hepburn and his nephew Patrick, who eventually became bishopric of Moray in 1538. Prior John's coat of arms is displayed on the towers and gates, but the Penn's Gate indicates that there had been an earlier wall, and the lower part of the wall on the northeast appears to be of earlier date. After a sermon given by John Knox at the parish church on the 11th of June, 1559, the congregation was so inspired and so aroused by his sermon that they proceeded to tear down the furnishings associated with, quote, popish worship. At the cathedral, the archbishop was pretty much defeated in his efforts. The church was abandoned immediately, since the parish church was sufficient for his reduced needs. The roofs were stripped and the building was reduced to a lifeless, abandoned ruin. Lord James Stewart, the lay administrator of the priory in place of the prior, continued to live in a part of the canon's cloister for some years after, but by 1597 the priory buildings were in decay. The Dominican friars, who still occupied prime building land in the burh, were a target of the reformers as well. These friars were eventually expelled from the land violently, and many buildings were demolished. The Scots were through with Catholicism and wished to never see it return. So after years of fighting between the Scots and the monarchs, it was finally decided by William of Orange in 1689 to leave the remains of the cathedral to rot. It eventually reduced to rubble. Here are some more pictures of the cathedral, just to give you a better idea of what it looks like today from afar. These are pictures that I took from my trip in 2015. Here's a picture I took from the very top of the bell tower. That's where a lot of people take pictures because you can see the grand view, and pictures don't do it justice, but it is quite breathtaking. This is the inside of St. Rule's Church, which I was able to get. I must say, it's not very impressive, and I was quite disappointed. But what else do you expect? I mean, I guess I shouldn't have been. I should have expected something like this because there's really not much to it left. Let's talk about a couple of the relics. There are relics that have been dug up and are currently on display in the Cathedral Visitor Center. One of the most important relics would be that of St. Andrew's sarcophagus, probably one of the most accomplished sculptures in Pictland. St. Andrew's sarcophagus was found during grave digging in 1833. It's a royal burial shrine of the late 18th century AD, perhaps a memorial to King Angus. Another important relic is this house-shaped grave marker. It was originally in a cemetery over a 9th century grave. Found in 1895 during building work at St. Leonard's School, it implies the early monastery had several burial grounds and extended to the south of the later cathedral precinct. One foundation legend mentions 7 churches. This link I wanted to include. I originally was planning on including a video in this presentation, but unfortunately I don't have the most updated version of PowerPoint. So I wasn't able to include a virtual video, but I did include the link to the video. Vimeo.com /779-28887. Copy that link. Go to it now after this presentation is over with. It's just a short little video of a computerized video of what the cathedral looked like in the 14th century. And it's quite astounding. It's breathtaking actually to see. And that is St. Andrew's Cathedral. I hope you enjoyed it, and I myself plan on returning one day to see it again, along with my family. Anyway, I am Father Fitzhugh, and you all have a very blessed day.